Hi, welcome everyone to another edition of Success Stories. This event is hosted by the Work on Climate community as a part of the broader Success Stories series. And for those of you who are not familiar with Work on Climate, we're a nonprofit focused on making climate work more accessible and mainstream. You can find us at workonclimate.org. For this event, what we do is we highlight some folks from the community that have made the transition to climate work so they can share their wisdom and insight with us on how this transition can be made possible. And today we have joining us Brett Tackaberry, who's a VP of Engineering at Azavea. Did I get that right, Brett?
Azavea.
Azavea, okay. Lowell Bander, who's a software engineer at Lumen Energy, and Izabela Suster, who's a sustainability analyst at World Centric. So why don't we just start off with, a really broad question. How does the job that you're in right now relate to climate, and how did you decide to get into it? Maybe let's start with Brett.
Sure. So Azavea is a geospatial software company, and we work on solutions in the climate adaptation space. So like we have some apps that may predict landslides, or we might have apps that map wildfire risk, land cover, land use, modeling water systems. And so, yeah, we have a very small, medium-sized team that makes those software solutions. Lowell, over to you.
Thanks for popcorning it. So I'm at Lumen Energy, and I have been for maybe like 4 months now. And the gist is that we help large commercial real estate owners profitably deploy clean energy, which I think is pretty self-explanatory tie into climate. Focusing right now on solar and maybe solar and storage, but broadening out from there as time goes on. Right now, a pretty small seed stage startup with about 20 folks. So trying to get expertise before spreading ourselves too thin. And I have a pretty long answer for how I got into this, but I guess the gist is it's kind of like a good blend of team size and company scale. And I think like the work that we're doing is easy for me to see like the material impact as opposed to something that's more abstract. That's very important to me. And like the work we're doing and how it ties into the business model also seems compelling, which coming from big ad tech previously had a much less compelling business model. Izabela, you're up.
Yes, so for myself, I work at World Centric. We're a compostable food packaging company, and kind of the broad term of sustainability analyst. Writing our ESG goals is something I do, but the bulk of my work is for life cycle assessment. So that is, creating the cradle to gate carbon footprint of our products to be able to identify emission hotspots, model, renewable energy usage and what those kind of GHG savings would be. So I think that is also self-explanatory in how that is climate-friendly work, but also, so much of our packaging, plastic packaging does come from single-serve food packaging. So yeah, that's it for me.
Excellent. Yeah. And before you got into these roles, were you exclusively looking for climate work, or was it something that was a happy accident, or one out of many dimensions that you were exploring?
Do you want us to just go through the panel?
Yeah. Feel free to jump in. Yeah. Whoever wants to share their wisdom.
Okay, well, I'll start. There isn't a lot of wisdom in this one, but for me, it was. I initially started looking in the social and tech for good space, as well as the climate space. When I was looking, mainly wanting to make that transition from basic just capital sort tech markets into something just a little bit more mission focused. So I did eventually narrow down to climate, but I started in looking in the tech for good space as well. Lowell?
Sure. So my like first pass is that I was kind of freaking out about my job not being meaningful and meaningful work being very important to me. And I was like looking through the stuff like how to switch into being a social worker and things like that. And my partner found this site for me, Tech Jobs for Good, which is generally like mission focused work. And so I was trying to keep a pretty like open perspective on what might be a good fit. But the thing that kept on seeming like the most pressing was the climate stuff. And it felt weird to go from like ad tech to like essentially blowing off like things that are like, cancer research or like education tech, which are comparatively like way more meaningful. But the climate stuff just seemed way more urgent and also tangible. Some of the stuff around like, for example, like education, other social things seemed like maybe that would work out or have like downstream effects that would be positive. But there's a lot of stuff in the climate space where you can like quantify like we are like producing this much clean energy or decarbonizing by this much. And that's very compelling to me just because I don't know, I feel like I've gotten very sensitive to like sloganeering and narrative stuff that kind of masks real impact behind a lot of words. So it's important to me to do something where it's like, oh, I'm clearly making impact, which is, there's different things within the climate space that have different amounts of that. But that's why clean energy specifically within climate seems appealing to me.
Isabel?
For myself, I'll say that I knew I wanted to kind of make the jump into the sustainability space very early on during my graduate training. My doctorate took 5 years, and I was creating so much plastic waste to, gather my thesis work, and that was really frustrating. And in the end, I knew after all that time, I was 100% certain, but sustainability is incredibly broad. And I thought the data skill set and the technical analysis skills could apply to many areas. But I did have, I try to apply somewhat of my own personal moral compass in choosing a company that has had a sustainability as a kind of central goal in their vision from the onset, whereas I think there are a lot of corporations hiring now that have really small sustainability teams. And I knew I didn't want to feel kind of defeated by the role or have limited influence. So I had kind of my own personal criteria in what kind of company I would like to work for. And it's difficult to be choosy, but it worked out. And I encourage people to actually take the roles at larger corporations if they have maybe a bolder personality or kind of can strong arm some board of directors, but I personally can't.
Yeah, I did have a follow-up for you, Izabela, on that. So you mentioned your background in academia prior to making this transition. So for anyone else that's sort of in your shoes, any insight you can share on making that transition? And has it been rewarding? Were there any things that were unexpected for you as you made that transition?
I will say, coming from academia, profit is, despite grant writing and things like this, numbers aren't really the focus. It's kind of getting the results, which is a skill I think carries over. In all my time trying to talk to people in the sustainability space during graduate school, had only met one other person who had successfully also completed a biomedical Ph.D. and had transitioned into a director of sustainability role. So we do exist. It's a very limited number of people, but I think there is a lot of crossover. The data technical analysis skills in any industry, I think, are extremely valuable, and learning kind of niche software and also just extracting kind of meaningful data from large data sets. So, and of course, reading research papers, which is kind of a very tedious skill. But I do think in a lot of job postings, it's not, it's not necessarily a direct call out for kind of a Bachelor of Science or higher kind of science degree, but there are a lot of applicable skills. So I think that kind of switch is definitely doable. It just may take a little bit longer in the job search.
Yeah, I think that's quite insightful. That actually brings me to another question that I wanted to ask you, Brett. So you're kind of in like mid-career, you're not like in your early career. So for a lot of folks that are sort of in that boat that might not have worked in climate, they have this hesitancy in terms of how they can tell that story, how they can make that transition. Maybe they feel like they're pigeonholed. Do you have any advice for folks like that who aren't sure how to go about translating their previous experience to climate work?
Yeah, so absolutely. So I found right away that, some of the things that I thought maybe were valuable, I had to relearn a little bit and unlearn. And so I had to rebuild some network. I had to work on adjusting what I might, how I might frame my resume and how I presented myself. And so I did that though from learning from other folks who were kind of coaching me through on this transition too. So there's some folks out there that I met through the community that have gone through this already, and so I learned from them that I might have to change how I approach the companies and how I present myself. And so that was one of the first things I had to do. Well, the first things I had to learn and unlearn. And so, it wasn't until then that my opportunity started to pivot a little bit and I started to get some leverage. But that was the first big step, though, is just reframing inside the space, knowing the terms and knowing, the movement and everything that's going sort of behind this is important to know going into this. You can't just expect to show up and with the skills and say, hey, there's a hero's welcome. No, it's like, okay, you kind of have to start from that first step again.
Yeah, that definitely makes sense. And this sort of connects to something you mentioned earlier, Izabela, as well. So I want to ask this question to all three of you. But as you are going about searching for these opportunities, how did you prioritize the opportunities? And then how did you look for things that were not greenwashing and so forth, but that were actually meaningful? Were there any criteria that you would advise people to go down to help them identify meaningful opportunities? And anyone can feel free to jump in. Yeah.
I found it, if you're if you have the confidence to like grill or like interrogate folks like during an interview process, it's like very helpful to suss out, because usually a company's marketing website is not the best description of like what they do. And so I found it very helpful to like talk to folks in like generally like in like work on climate or my climate journey and spaces like that who have a little bit more experience, or even just doing interviews before being super confident that you're like convinced that it's like not greenwashed. I found it really helpful to also work with I guess like mission-oriented headhunters. So there's like groups like Climate People, which is climate specific, and like folks at Single Sprout, which is generally mission-oriented but has some climate stuff, which is nice to have like a companion who isn't the person you're interviewing with, but is also like makes it a lot less lonely than just you, where you can like suss out like how are they like making money, which obviously that's not the most important part, but that like very much informs like how their business model operates, and kind of can inform you like what might be the sticking points in terms of development. So I thought those things were helpful. And being like clear during your interviews, like, oh, like has your team ensure that like what you're working on is like important and aligned with your mission. And some answers I got to that were very compelling, and some answers I got seemed like, oh, that's like, it's like we kind of hope that we trend towards that, but it's not as clear. And I've gotten like very like impatient and picky, so I wanted stuff that was like, oh yes, that's obviously impactful, not like maybe down the road it will be.
I'll say for myself during the job search that, in writing a few personalized lines to each company, just spending time on their website. And Lowell did mention that marketing does a really good job of kind of, over amplifying maybe eco-friendly initiatives that aren't actually being implemented, but in just trying to write a few lines per cover letter that are specific to the company, you actually have to spend a lot of time on the site, because you can kind of wade through the very general information. And once you find very specific things that you want to call out, I think that can help you weigh, how environmentally focused a company is. I will also say all the numerous job boards, I think, already kind of pre-call the number of job postings to be specific to the climate community. So Green Biz Jobs, Work on Climate, I believe, has a daily post as well in the Slack channel. So in that way, the community also helps kind of do the pre-selection for you.
I think in addition to adding on to what Izabela and Lowell both said, I always found a good signal was, say, I guess call it, not maturity is the wrong word, but more just like how good is, like, say, the HR team and the recruiting experience. If the interviews are set up well and they're timely and thoughtful questions and respectful, it's usually pretty good indication that the company is set up well, or if the company cares about the people by way of the HR department, I think you're going to get a pretty good sense that the company's going to be good or at least trustworthy based on the website. And then other signals like, are they a B Corp, or, how do they talk about, employees or their internal culture through the blog? I think all those things are really good signals to the quality of the company. And that's certainly what resonated with me as I was going through sort of my stages with Azavea, where I ended up at.
I think also just asking like the kinds of projects that they're working on now or have worked on recently, which I think kind of gets away from like reading off of the JD or something like that, and like, oh, what concretely are you doing, and does that line up with like what I would expect you to be doing? Is I think very helpful.
Sure, yeah, that does make sense. And then Lowell, I had a question for you. You worked in big tech before, and then you've done a few other jobs since, and now you're working at Lumen Energy. What was that transition like from the organization of big tech? Like, what were some of the fears that were in your mind as you were making that transition? And for, it's particularly pertinent at the moment because of all of these layoffs we've been having in big tech. But what advice do you have for folks that are going through that? Is this a good time to consider climate work? And how might you allay some of those fears? Like, what's warranted, what's unwarranted, you think?
Yeah, I mean, I think certainly it's like in pretty clear that like it's not 100% guaranteed that you'll like have a secure job if you're in big tech from the recent layoffs. I think a lot of my fears were around like pessimism that I would find a job that I'd actually want to spend time doing. And previously I kind of thought like, oh, most tech is just to like make the rich richer, and I just want to find a job where I can work as little as possible and make as much money. And so certainly like the notion of switching in something mission oriented and have that be like an early stage startup seemed like a bad idea. Which certainly now on the other side of that, it's like very exhilarating. And my problem is more so like, oh, sometimes I'm like too excited and I have trouble like sleeping well, which is very different from like having a lot of dread of like kind of being in meetings and pretending like I care about what people are talking about. So like the message I would at least send to myself back in a time capsule is like, it's worth it to like explore your assumptions, because I think I kind of had like a naive picture of what it would be like. And also even like in terms of compensation, that I figure I kind of had this image that like certainly if you're doing both a startup and it's mission oriented, you're just going to be paid like nothing. But I'm being paid like, I don't know, like 2/3 of what I was being paid at Facebook, which is like a decrease. But I would like, if there was some way to get even more meaning and like take less money, I would do that, because it's much more useful for me to like be enjoying myself and feel like my work has meaning than it is to like retire sooner or buy more stuff or anything like that. So I think those are some of the big things. And there's a lot of things that are just, I think, maybe more specific to startups and less so just climate particularly, but like my team, it's like doesn't have like performance reviews or something, which you might have in like in a bigger company. It's just like, are we all working on what we should be working on? Which is important for me to like kind of be not like abstracted away from the reason. I don't spend time like describing why what I'm doing is important to like people that I'm never going to meet, like who are like my like boss's boss's boss. It's just like me and co-founder and team is just talking about like what we should work on. And that's always a lot more motivating for me, which makes it a lot easier to do my job.
Yeah, that definitely makes sense. And anything to add to that, Brett or Izabela? Just around advice for folks that might be affected by some of these layoffs and how they might go about structuring their applications to some of these climate rules.
I personally know just from my experience at my company that I don't know, food service is always growing, so I can't speak to the tech industry, which I know is undergoing massive layoffs. I can say there are just so many innovative materials in the food packaging space that I feel like in a similar way in tech that there are so many startups, and I don't know, I had a long job search period, but I do believe in kind of if you can and you can wait and find the most suited role to you, it will show up. I don't. That's all.
There's a lot of truth to that. There's a lot of that I really sort of kind of resonates with me. I feel that I'm kind of optimist too, and I feel that if you set forth on this kind of path that you want to achieve, that if it's driven by good values, you probably end up in a good place. And given the fact that we have a ton of work to do to solve this sort of kind of crisis we're in, I can't imagine there being any less need in the future, or it being affected with by stock prices and all that in the same kind of way that big tech is. And so I don't think it's, I mean, yeah, you might not get those big salaries out of the gates, but you're going to get 2/3. You're going to get probably more than enough to survive and do good work and feel good about it. I don't think there's any the future's uncertain, is as uncertain there.
And I might not make like as bold of a claim as I've seen on LinkedIn about like the climate economy being like recession proof, but at least seems like a lot more like tied to real societal needs than a lot of companies that are laying people off. So that's like, I think, helpful for me. And I think that like the taking time off stuff is super good, especially also for like that, like being aware of greenwashing. I think if you're in a rush, then it's easier to just be like, okay, it's, I have some like misgivings, but I just need a job, so I'm going to take it. And obviously everyone's like situation is different. But if you have the ability to wait, it's very helpful to be a little bit more picky. And I certainly know from personal experience that like having the technical means to wait is not the same as like feeling comfortable waiting. So I had to like repeatedly be like, it's okay. I am not gonna like lose my apartment immediately if I like don't find a job next month. So that was helpful. And then also, at least in terms of like maybe startups being riskier than like the big tech stuff, that it seems like a lot of folks don't have their jobs for very long anyways, like they leave voluntarily. I was at Facebook for 5.5 years, which seems like a little bit longer than a lot of folks. So if you're in a few startups that each last like 2 to 3 years, that's like not that necessarily different from switching around to like get a big salary, bouncing around FANG stuff, and you might like learn a lot more in the meantime.
Yeah, I think that makes sense. There's a question on the chat, and for the rest of the audience, feel free to put your questions into the chat, and we'll start addressing them. If you'd like to ask it yourself, just ping me or Pratyusha on chat, and we'll let you unmute and ask your question yourself. There's a question for you, Izabela, from Nick. How long was your search? You mentioned that it took you some time. How long exactly was that?
Oh boy. Oh gosh. Okay. So my search took, I would say, almost exactly 6 months. I completed my degree, and I know that that's not everyone's position, and I'm incredibly grateful. I also didn't want to carry my negative experience in graduate school to my next position. I say it all the time. It's kind of my personal Mount Everest to not talk about it, especially in a field where people don't care, have the frame of reference to understand kind of a graduate school experience. So I took the time to graduate, move, and then, and I will say, to Lowell's point, you can kind of in a panic apply to a job, and then you have less energy devoted to kind of parsing out through the greenwashing. But I also, it took so much time to apply to so many positions, and there are so many that are posted, which is why it's also, I haven't been on the job boards recently. I know there are layoffs, but I felt that there was such a large number of positions, and that, yeah, if I had had a role and then tried to apply, I think the good ones might have slipped through because I was just expending so much energy on applying. But I know that it's a unique position, and but I really said, whenever anyone asked me or things were getting tough, I would say I can't imagine doing anything else, and I really could not imagine doing something not climate related. So it worked out. I was an optimist for a very long time.
Yeah, and I guess on the flip side, I did want to ask you, I'm sure all of you interview folks for hiring, in your current role. So I'll ask this to you first, Brett, and then we can have Lowell and Izabela chime in as well. But when you're hiring folks in, especially in your current role, right, which is climate oriented, what do you look for in that person? Or to ask it another way, what should folks be focusing on when they present themselves as candidates that will help you as well?
Oh, that's a good question. So our HR department really quite thoughtful in how they've crafted the application process, but there's a big component. A component of it is an alignment with values, and it's in a way where the applicant does give a chance to say why there's a fit, but also we do look for this a concept that their values, that they're here for the right reason, so to speak. And it's not so much about like culture fit. It's more about are you are you not necessarily an optimist, I guess, but do you feel that with the effort that we can sort of fix the problems that we have and contribute to solution. Of course, there's all the technical components too. We're a software company too, but a big part of it, it's the values alignment is important for sure.
Excellent. Lowell?
I've only been involved in like the technical evaluation aspect for hiring for Lumen thus far, but at least from like my perspective as like an interviewee, it definitely helps to just be like ruthlessly authentic, because I don't think like now if you're in the interview cycle, you don't want to like front and be someone you're not and then like wind up with a team that you're not like vibing with, which I think that's like a lot easier for me to do in the climate space, or it's harder like for like big tech to like pretend like I care about some of the problems that big tech works on. But it was a lot easier for me to like be clear about what was important to me. And I think that's important to like polarize the situation that way. Like you should find out like whether or not it's a good fit. It's not just like, I don't just like dating. You don't want to like pretend like you're someone you're not and then like be unhappy later on. So I think it's important to just be like clear about what's important to you. And if they're like, oh, we don't do that, then it's probably better that you don't work there. Which I think also helps to just kind of like blunt some of the like necessary emotional damage of interviewing, of like, oh, I don't know, they didn't like accept me, maybe it's like not a good fit. It's like, okay, that's like not so bad, maybe like it wasn't, and it's better to like figure that out now than like slog through a job you don't like.
Isabella?
I will say, as a one-person department, that I am not actively involved in a lot of hirings. I do onboarding meetings with anyone who joins the team, and I really try to call out that I am the kind of resource to go to when a customer asks for, a product carbon footprint or kind of any more data-focused questions. But I will say that I think is an advantage of being a smaller company or a small team is kind of the cultural fit. So even we all, have kind of similarly aligned interests to work for such a company. And so if there's a cultural fit, I think numerous people can sense it. And in that way, maybe that person doesn't join the team, and it may just be that it is a big adjustment coming from other large corporations that we have, much smaller group and much more kind of interest aligned groups.
I see. Yeah, I think all of that is quite insightful. One thing I wanted to ask you, Izabela, you mentioned how challenging grad school was, and how it's difficult for others that haven't been through that experience to relate to it. So on that general theme, I was wondering, what are things that climate companies can do to open the field up for unconventional people to bring their perspectives in, people with like not the traditional background? Like, are there things that you think can be done to make this work more accessible for folks from other backgrounds?
That's a very good question. And I think that there should just be kind of more open resources about, like for life cycle assessment. I took a course that at the time was available, and I'm sure it would be very expensive otherwise if it wasn't free. But life cycle assessment, it was numerous weeks, numerous hours, but otherwise I find that these softwares are generally, behind a very large paywall, so that you cannot have kind of the hands-on experience you would need in potentially applying to life cycle assessment roles or any other number of softwares. But I think in writing the job description, I do see, like kind of bachelor's of science, but I think kind of then in lieu of professional experience, you can ask for a higher degree which is what I think would allow more folks to enter. And of course, also, I just try to engage in numerous extracurricular activities on the campus where I completed my graduate degree. So also allowing that to count as experience since you're contributing to kind of large climate projects, even though it's not your full-time work.
Great, yeah. And just to kind of extend that question for you, Brett and Lowell as well. For folks that aren't sure how their skills apply to climate work at all, right? How do you go about exploring that journey yourself to understand what part you have to play within this larger body of work?
Yeah, I think that's important, but I mean, I do want to touch on that first part of that question first, because the jobs look very similar to what you might find in other tech companies. I mean, even myself, I was able to make this transition without, a lot of retraining, retooling. I was able to take all my skills sideways and start working. And so these jobs look very similar. And I imagine too, like if you're working in full stack, the companies look similar, just smaller. And so it's certainly transferable. So there's no reason why someone looking for the next job can't start in this. And so how do those companies address that market is really important. And so it's you have to do this kind of double duty. Companies in tech have to do this double duty of reaching out into regular markets, say, hey, come over here, you're going to do good, and it's going to be the same job. And I think organizations like Climate Bases, it plays a big role in that. But like even them, they have to get outside of this ecosystem where everyone already knows about these places. And because I remember when I started, it was I felt like I was stepping into this kind of dark room. I wasn't quite sure what's going on in this space. But if we can spread the word to our friends and peers and say, hey, when you're looking for your next job, go to this community first. Go to Work on Climate and just see what's going on, and go to Climate Base, see what's going on. You may find your next thing here. And that's how you get into it. And I think that we all have to kind of collectively say, okay, check out these communities. And so I've been, as part of, this transition, as I've moved over, I've been trying to tell my peers that are still in the sort of, capital markets and regular tech company to check out these other places to find that next job. Because it's not super easy to just switch, but it's totally doable and viable, and anyone can do it. Lowell?
Yeah, I think so. I'm pretty, I guess, privileged in that a full stack role is I have zero climate experience. I was in these Slack communities and listened to a couple of podcasts, but I don't think that that was at all a barrier. And at least my team broadly is 20 or so folks, and only a small handful of us have a climate relevant background, and the rest of us are kind of learning as we go. And I think that might vary based on your industry, and certainly based on your role. I've talked to a few more product leaning folks who have struggled with interviews because they have that more higher expectation of domain relevance, which makes sense because that's kind of your expertise is developing a product as opposed to developing the technical aspect. So for me, I can't really comment because I've been kind of blessed with that. Although there was some stuff that was maybe oh, they want a robotics engineer, and even though that's technically programming, it's not really my forte, but that's I think kind of independent of the fact that it's a climate-based role. Yeah.
Excellent. We do have a question from the audience. Aditya, feel free to unmute and ask it.
For sure. Thanks to all three of you for sharing your journeys. I wanted to ask a question. What would be your advice for, I guess, landing your first interview? So that is are job boards on climate, do they have a high effectiveness rate in terms of when you apply, or is networking a better way to sort of land that first interview? And if networking is a good thing to do, what would be your advice as to how to go about it? Should we just talk to people indiscriminately, or is there a better way to target it?
I think I probably also there's a little bit of privilege from having worked at a big tech company beforehand, so it's more likely to get in the door. I personally find going the more human route a lot less overwhelming and lonely. It also kind of narrows it down because the number of people that are willing to talk to you is smaller than the number of posts you might find on something like Climate Base. But I found it very helpful to be explicit about what I was looking for on multiple dimensions, both in terms of oh, I want commercial industrial clean energy deployment and it needs to be like remote and I want to be on a small team, and like sharing that out in like different Slack communities can be helpful to then like be put in touch with people who either like are like maybe in something adjacent and we'll talk to you about that stuff, or like I met folks that like are like VCs in the space and will like refer me to like small teams that maybe are just like two co-founders and are looking for like a founding engineer. And I found that to be a lot more helpful, so you can kind of like suss out in advance like, oh, what is the role like, is that what I'm looking for, and have someone that's like on your side and can like talk it over with you, as opposed to like just you looking at like 1,000 job listings and like shooting them out into the ether. I felt that was like pretty darn helpful.
I'll jump in. Yeah, I'd definitely echo what Lowell said. I had to do all of that as well. All those channels too, in the communities, work in climate and MCJ and climate action tech, and then reach out to VCs, reach out to, connections on LinkedIn, all that, sometimes indeterminate and just to say hi, other times specifically about job positions. In addition, I found I had to also put a lot of effort into the resume and like the branding on LinkedIn and all that, just to kind of even get that first. Sometimes I had to go into this, this application process is kind of cold. And so just to get that first call back, I found I had to do a lot of work on the branding and crafting those intro messages and all that. I put a lot of work into always tweaking those too.
I'll just add in that I did apply for and get the role I'm currently in through a job board. So there is still success in like the old fashioned way, but I will say that as soon as you attend a conference, or as soon as I had one informational interview, it always almost led to like 2 more. It kind of just had the trickle down effect where someone like remembers that they have a friend who's in a more relevant industry where you may want to talk to, and it kind of steamrolls from there. And as much as someone from outside the space trying to look in, you may have an idea of some of the big players, but really if you do want to work at a smaller company, as soon as you have a few informational interviews and you start hearing the same names, it opens up a whole new world, kind of where to look for job postings.
Mm-hmm.
And folks are usually very open to like talk. At least people seem very like generally helpful, which I think is like makes sense, because folks aren't in it here for like the money necessarily, are much more like, oh, our planet's gonna die, so like I'm happy to help a newbie. So I think it makes sense to like put yourself out there, and also to like be clear about the kind of like support or answers you're looking for. If you're just like message folks like, hey, do you have time to chat next week, that's like much less like appealing to me than like, oh, I looked at your website and it looks like you're dealing with this, how does this relate to that, or something like that. And that's like a much more interesting question, which even like helps me like understand like my own company and like how it relates to other players. So I think those things are both important.
Does that answer your question, Aditya, or any follow-up questions?
Yep, I think that answered the question. Thanks.
Great. Renee has a question. I think it's referring to something you mentioned, Lowell. Can you say more on how you networked or partnered with VCs to get connected with startups?
Yeah, very much not intentionally. There's just like, I guess to what I just said, there's a bunch of like really nice, helpful people in these Slack communities. So I was just like open about like what I was looking for, and folks like reached out. And I feel like I think it helps to like be vocal, and maybe you need to repeat yourself, because it's like it's Slack, and if like people don't see it, then it just like scrolls up into the abyss. And certainly also at my climate journey, it seems to be like well positioned where it's both like a VC fund, but they also like steward that community. So they were like helped me to like get connected directly to they are a VC, and they helped me get collected to a couple early roles. So those are all helpful, and there's specific channels for that too if you're like looking to like network folks. And also depending on where you are, there's a lot of in-person meetups, and that can also be helpful for meeting folks, which at least to me previously, like VC is like someone I hear about in a podcast and never meet in person. So it's cool to just like meet someone at a bar with 20, 100 other people, and chat about like what's available, which to me it makes sense. I don't know, if you're a venture capitalist and you're investing in companies, you want people to work at those companies so that they're successful for both financial and planetary reasons. And if someone's snobbish and doesn't want to talk to you, you probably don't want to work with them anyways.
We have another question that's sort of related to this community aspect. So when this comes from Pratyusha, so when we're networking with folks, how do you go about seeking referrals or something a bit more concrete from those conversations? Any experience with that sort of opportunity, Lowell or Brett, Isabel?
I would say to just give as much detail as possible. I felt like a lot of my early networking while I was still in graduate school was like, I'm just generally interested in helping the planet, which is just too broad and does not give any indication of what skill set you want to apply that to or what you think is kind of most appropriate. And people aren't going to do the mental heavy lifting of like thinking about you as a person and what skills you have and like what's most appropriate. That's not something people generally can do for you. So I think just having as much detail as possible. And of course, again, having your own criteria and trying to talk to people at kind of the model companies, because I find that, small companies talk to small companies, large companies talk to large companies. So just, directing your energy to talk to someone who has either a similar role or works in the space, kind of similar or the company size that you also want to end up in.
Got it. So we are just being conscious of time. We're approaching the end of the allocated time, and we would love to do some breakout sessions as well. So before we move to that, I would like to ask all of you a question, in which we kind of turn the tables. So I guess if there's one thing that the broader community can do to help you, what would that be? Let's start with Lowell.
The broader community can do to help me personally?
Yeah, the broader climate community, anything that they can do to help you, your work, the current company.
That's a fun ask. I guess me personally, if you're like in the Seattle area or know people in the Seattle area, come to a Seattle meetup. We've got one scheduled for tomorrow, so maybe you won't make that one, but we're trying to do it every month. And if you or anyone you know wants to be a tech lead manager at Lumen Energy, hit me up on LinkedIn.
Brett?
Sure. We're currently trying to connect more into this space. I mean, the company's been around for 20 years, predating this concept of this special kind of new community and all that. But we're still trying to serve the community. So we have this great machine learning and geospatial technology that can help fledgling startups. So definitely want to continue to meet up with others in the space. Like Lowell said, I'm on all these communities and would be happy for folks to reach out. In addition to, we are, Azavea is hiring for a engineering manager position too. It's in the research and ML space. And yeah, you can find me in those communities if you're interested.
I would say for myself that just kind of the deprivatization or kind of just lifting the screen off of a lot of life cycle assessment data, since so much of it is kind of, primary measurements that companies do at their sites, and it's really difficult to find that data available publicly. And so we're all kind of manufacturing somewhat the same materials, but all, paying a lot for software to run the analyses for us. And I think by having those measurements sooner, you can start writing climate goals sooner, and it just speeds things along. It's just still kind of privatized in my opinion. So just if you can share any LCA data, I'd love to look at it.
Excellent. Well, we'll start moving into our breakout sessions, but I just wanted to thank all of the speakers for all of the advice and insight that you shared. It was a great conversation for me, and I'm sure the audience took away a lot from it as well. So for the breakout sessions, what we'll do is really have a discussion around a single question. What is preventing you from working in climate? And if you are working in climate already, what are things that you can do to help those that are looking for work in climate, or any advice? So we'll try to have a breakout around that. And, as we go into the breakout rooms, you can follow any thread of conversation that you wish. We'll randomly assign everyone to these rooms, except for the 3 speakers who will split into 3 rooms, and we'll have a work on climate moderator as well. But again, thank you everyone for attending the conversation today, and a big thank you to our speakers.
Thank you so much, Utkarsh.
Thank you.